Well, I think we'll get started. My name is Betsy Barron, and we're coming to you on Zoom, the UC Retiree Learning Series, and it's sponsored today by St. Paul's Towers, where I am, and by San Francisco Towers, more Front Porch communities. Before we get started, I want to give you some instructions on how to submit your questions. Please submit your questions through the Q&A, which you can see as a Q umlaut A at the bottom of your screen. If you would just like to make a comment, you can put that in the chat, but what's in the chat is not going to be read and directly answered by our speakers. Okay. Sigrid Mueller is coming to us from the UC Berkeley Emeriti Academy program. She's the manager, and she is going to be introducing our guest today. Sigrid?
Thank you, Betsy, for your kind introduction, and a warm welcome to all of you joining today for a conversation about this summer's Oppenheimer movie. On behalf of the UC Berkeley Retirement Center, I'd like to thank the Front Porch communities and Betsy Barron for their support and partnership producing the UC Retiree Learning Series. Our goal is to provide educational opportunities and raise awareness of care communities like St. Paul's Tower and Front Porch San Francisco. Though we usually meet in person, today's event comes to you online. However, we look forward to resuming face-to-face events hopefully soon. For those interested in learning more about Front Porch, Betsy will post contact information in the Zoom chat feature. In a moment, I will introduce our guest speakers and begin today's discussion by asking them a few questions. After that, we will get to as many audience questions as time permits. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Jon Else and David Hollinger. Jon Else is Professor Emeritus at UC Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism and acclaimed documentary filmmaker. He has been producing and directing documentary films since 1980, and in 1988 received a MacArthur Fellowship. His numerous honors and awards include 4 Emmys and the Sundance Filmmakers Trophy. Jon was producer and cinematographer for Eyes on the Prize, a multi-part PBS documentary from the late 1980s about America's civil rights movement. He's also author of the 2017 book, True South, Henry Hampton and Eyes on the Prize, the landmark television series that reframed the civil rights movement. From Jon's long and varied list of documentary accomplishments, The Day After Trinity, J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Atomic Bomb is seminal to our discussion today. It came out in 1980 and was nominated for an Academy Award in 1981. The documentary features first ever interviews with several of Oppenheimer's fellow scientists at Los Alamos, as well as colleagues and friends from Berkeley and the Manhattan Project. David Hollinger is the Preston Hotchkiss Professor Emeritus at UC Berkeley's Department of History. He's a member of the American Philosophical Society and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a Fellow of the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, a member of the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and Harmsworth Professor at the University of Oxford. Professor Hollinger is the author of more than a dozen books that investigate and critique American intellectual history, American Protestantism, and the sometimes fraught dynamics between the religious, the secular, the scientific, the liberal, and the cosmopolitan. His most recent book is Christianity's American Fate: How Religion Became More Conservative and Society More Secular published last year. In 2005, Hollinger co-edited with Catherine Carson Reappraising Oppenheimer, a 6-part volume created after UC Berkeley conference to mark the centennial of Oppenheimer's birth in 1904. The book brings together new scholarship on a variety of aspects about Oppenheimer's life. In his afterword to the book, Professor Hollinger writes, "Whatever else J. Robert Oppenheimer may have been, he was a uniquely prominent site for the emergence and often violent action of forces that largely defined the historical epoch in which he lived." Thank you so much, David and Jon, for joining us for this event today. I would like to direct my first question to the both of you. Historians and documentary filmmakers share some general rubrics in their methods and approach. Both use the most accurate source material available to interpret and reinterpret historic events. Each of you has produced a history of Oppenheimer and his era in different narrative media. How would you assess Christopher Nolan's Hollywood movie about Robert Oppenheimer's life and work? David, maybe we're going to start with you.
I think we need to begin by remembering that we're talking about a Hollywood movie. This is a commercial movie. Now, from a historian's point of view, where we as historians are rarely pleased with Hollywood movies about historical subjects, this one seems to me to be remarkably successful as judged by historian standards. So for me, it's a cause for rejoicing. Now, when I say it's a largely accurate movie, I mean accurate not only in verisimilitude, not only in, well, the cars are all rightly 1942 cars and people are dressed in 1942 and 3 clothing. It's not that, but the sorts of things that historians really care about are represented pretty well. For example, the changing relation of science to weapons technology. This comes across very well. Related to that, the relation of scientific communities to political order. That's a very big change at this time. That's right there in the movie all the way through. The development of the national security state, and we had nothing like that on that scale until after the episodes described in this movie. It's all there. We see General Groves putting it together minute by minute right before the screen, and then we see its consequences later on. The McCarthy era. What about the dynamics of the McCarthy era? Well, okay, there's a lot of stuff on film about that. But this account of how the McCarthy era actually worked and how juridical power could be manipulated by people, this is just very vividly put forth, both in the hearings of 1954, where they deprive Oppenheimer of his security clearance, but also in the 1959 hearing about Strauss. And I think a weakness logistically in the film is that we go from 1954 to 1959 very quickly. And that later part in 59 is crucial because that's where Nolan actually shows the decline of the power of the McCarthy era. And that's something that's brought out very vividly. And then finally, I would say, the movie is remarkably accurate about individuals, about Oppenheimer himself, a being to whom things happen, as well as somebody who does things. The account of his activities, of his genius, wonderfully set forth, but crucially, it's so good on his mistakes, And I'll just mention 2 of the most horrendous. So here he's got a chance to talk to the president of the United States. And it's about, international control of atomic energy, which is something that he's really committed to, and he's right on top of this. And here's his chance to talk to the President of the United States. Totally blows it. I mean, he just behaves terribly. Okay, that's one. Second, like 9 years later, when this McCarthy era stuff, and they're out to get him, and Strauss and his friends are out to purge him, he doesn't fight it properly. He just caves in. He makes one mistake after another. I thought that Nolan was magnificently merciless in getting that across, that really important historical event in relationship between scientific intelligentsias and political power and the dynamics of McCarthyism. The most powerful scientist in the world could be destroyed, partly through his own agency. He might have been able to fight it, might have been able to support friends, didn't do it. And other characters, I mean, it's very good on General Groves. I think it's very good on Kitty Oppenheimer. There are a lot of things about it that are very good. I would say it's possible to list things that weren't done as well. It's possible to list things that weren't mentioned at all, but should have. And we can talk about that more as we go on, and there is a lot there to be said. But as we engage that, I think it might be important to remember a wonderful wisecrack of I.I. Rabi when he was meeting with the board on Oppenheimer's security clearance. Rabi says, this guy has accomplished this and this and this and this and this. And what do you want? Mermaids? So I would say, what do we want from this Hollywood director, Christopher Nolan? Do we want mermaids?
Thank you, David. Jon, same question to you. You have to unmute yourself.
My screen is occasionally freezing, by the way, so if you lose me, we'll try to reconnect. Better? Good. I'm happy to weigh in on everything, or to second everything that David has said, and I think especially his opening note, which is from his essay in the Reappraising Oppenheimer book, that Oppenheimer is a site. And in that sense, he's absolutely right, that Oppenheimer, we have a cascade of Oppenheimers now, going back to slightly before the day after Trinity. We have at least 5 films about him. We have an epic poem now, Critical Assembly by John Cannaday, which is great. We have plays. We have a rather extraordinary opera by John Adams. So it is in fact a continuity, a conveyor belt, a continuum of evocations of this man who seems to be a magnet for so many philosophical and frankly practical and personal issues in the 20th century. I have to go on record, by the way, from the very beginning, Sal. I liked the movie a lot. I thought Christopher Nolan did an extraordinary job of filmmaking. I'm with David that it's not perfect, but hats off to him. God bless him for getting the nuclear weapons back out into the national conversation. Now, along this long trail of ever-changing evocations of Robert Oppenheimer, I firmly believe that these stories have to be retold anew every generation. I mean, the only people who are more skeptical of historically based feature films are people who make historical documentary films. I mean, we were all ready to hate this film, and we didn't. I especially commend Nolan's willingness to embrace the complexity of it. I mean, this is this is Tolstoy in 3 hours, or if you're going to be cynical, it's a Wikipedia page in a movie. I'll go for the Tolstoy. I think it is easy to shy away from the vast cast of characters. It's easy to shy away from these knotty philosophical questions, first about whether or not to make this device, and then more important, what finally to do with this, what Håkon Chevalier called this this terrible contrivance after the defeat of the Nazis, for whom the bomb was intended from the beginning. One last thing I'll say, scholars like David are the ones who go into the archives and they find 10,000 documents. And then Marty Sherwin, who was a friend of both of ours and was an advisor on the day after Trinity, goes in and finds another 5,000, 10,000. And you folks, you scholars, reduce those to a 500-page book. And then we come along and we reduce that 500 pages to, at best, 75 minutes, which reduces to about 75 pages. So, on a good day, you can think of it as espresso, that we are condensing your work to its essence. On a bad day, it's just dumbing down all the magnificent work that you guys have done.
Jon, you're providing me with a perfect segue to my next question for David. Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin's 2005 Pulitzer Prize-winning book, American Prometheus, endeavored to flesh out and illuminate Robert Oppenheimer's life and era. Christopher Nolan embraced the book as a guide map for his movie. David, you knew Bird and Sherwin, and you were conversant with them as they worked on the book. The book and film may now be compared and contrasted in their attempts to tell the same story. Do you find inherent in either genre particular strengths or limits to the making of accurate historical narrative when so much living memory and other material is available to work with?
The remarkable thing about the Bird-Sherwin book is how much of the material that's out there is in the book. Now, during the years since it was published in 2005, more stuff has come out. I'm not denying that. But of the material that was out there already, there was a lot of it. So much of it is in there. Not to say everything, but really so much of it. Now, you mentioned that I knew particularly Marty Sherwin very well, and that's true. I should say that Marty and I became friends in 1967 when we had offices next to one another in Donnell Hall here in Berkeley. We were both beginning our careers as historians then, and in the intervening years, we different places where we had appointments all over the United States, but we remained in contact. And I remember vividly in the years about 1978, 79, 80, when Marty was being praised for his excellent first book, A World Destroyed, which is an account of the diplomacy of the bomb. Why did the United States drop these bombs on Japan? What was the relation of politics to the Soviet Union? How necessary was it militarily? All those issues. He really does a great job on that. So then after that, he's trying to figure out what to do next. And he has this idea that maybe he would do Oppenheimer. Now, I'm one of a number of people I know, a lot of friends that have told similar stories about their time with Marty, where they would be walking along a beach with him or talking to him at a restaurant or meeting at his home. And he would go over this question, gee, am I really going to do this Oppenheimer book? And of course, our attitude, and I know I speak not only for myself, was maybe on the flippant side. Of course you can do it. Yeah, go ahead. But what I realized over the long run, he understood the problem. He understood the depth, the magnitude of this project. We did not. We were not going to do it. We're urging him to do it. But he went in and did it. So year after year, he does this magnificent research. And the body of research that he got was vast. I visited his study several times and would watch it increasing. And there came a time when he wasn't able to write it. It just wasn't coming together. It was so vast. And this was painful for his friends because there were all these years where we would meet with him and he was excited about something he'd discovered. He'd just gotten back from the Vannevar Bush papers or the James Conant papers or an interview with Håkon Chevalier, and he had all this great stuff. But then it's not coming together. And then he realizes he really needs to get somebody to help him. And he shrewdly, wisely asked Kai Bird. Kai Bird he knew slightly. They weren't close friends, but they knew him. And the thing about Kai Bird, he's a brilliant writer and he's fast. He kept turning out these books, really good books, fast. Marty needed a co-author who could read through this vast quantity of research, talk it over with him, and produce a 60-page chapter, then another, and another, and another. And that's what happened. So this is a magnificent collaboration. And some people watching this might be interested in Kai's own webinars on this. I'm sure they're on YouTube or somewhere. You can look them up. He did a couple of them for the Institute for Advanced Study. Forget where I did the other ones. But the thing to hear Kai describe the process of working with Marty, and it's especially touching for those of us who were close to Marty for so many years since he died just before the movie came out, that Kai has the role then as the surviving co-author to represent Marty Sherwin appropriately as the joint author of this, what to do when he is there to receive all these accolades and his co-author is not. I'm just saying that Kai Bird's personal character comes out in a wonderful fashion when you hear him talking about his friend and co-author Marty Sherwin. So I think it's a great book. Maybe somebody will eventually produce something even greater on it. But for the people watching this webinar, if you haven't read it, I really recommend it.
John, I would like to follow up with a somewhat related question. During the introduction, your acclaimed 1980 documentary about Oppenheimer was mentioned. That documentary came out roughly 40 years after the Manhattan Project. Now 40 more years have passed. What are some of your thoughts about the choices Nolan made and strategies he used to characterize Oppenheimer and his era?
Well, my first thought is that the fact we're all here today on this lovely afternoon talking about all this counts as a great success story, because it's hard to re-evoke now the terror of global nuclear war immediately after Hiroshima, all the way up through the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. When we were making The Day After Trinity, we began production in 1977. And I believe that was the peak, near the peak of global armament. And there were something like 60,000 nuclear weapons at the ready around the globe. Today, not only have we not blown ourselves up, but we are down to something around 7,000 or 8,000. Now that's still vastly too many, but we have in place a number of treaties that were not in place then. So, in some ways, the more I study this, the more optimistic I become, which I know sounds counterintuitive. Every film, whether it's a documentary or a feature or a book, is both an interpretation of the history depicted, but it also tells you something about the moment when the film was made, and the moment it tells you something about the personalities of the people who made it. We did The Day After Trinity as the very first film about Oppenheimer. Surprisingly, in that 40 years between Hiroshima and when we began, 42 years, there had been no film, and there were very few books. Philip Stern had a book, The Oppenheimer Case, that was Brighter Than 1,000 Suns by Jung, a good book called Day of Trinity by Lansing Lamont. And there was the transcript of Oppenheimer's security hearing, which one of the commissioners had accidentally left on a commuter train. It was classified. And when the Atomic Energy Commission found out, they had no choice but to publish the transcript, and the floodgates opened and all the testimony became public. So I have to give a shout out to my collaborators because they're relevant to this question. David and Janet Peoples, who live at St. Paul's, collaborated with me on writing this film, and then David edited the film. And early on, their plan was to frame the Oppenheimer story around the hearing. Let's come right out of the gate with the security hearing, and then we will tell the entire story by checkerboarding this bizarre kangaroo court with the history of the development of the Trinity shot, Hiroshima, and the later development of the hydrogen bomb. I thought it was brilliant. It is brilliant. The problem was that very few people knew who Oppenheimer was. Very few people were coming to this with anything but an ignorance about the subject matter. And we were afraid that we had to retreat and do a film that was sort of numbskull clear. So we did not do that. We adopted a straight ahead narrative. We narrated the film, which is very much out of style now, but it's an incredibly efficient way to convey complex information. So in the intervening years, there's been so much writing. This story has been done a lot of times. And I hope that in some way was liberating for Christopher Nolan and allowed him to fracture time in a way that we never could. Now, I think sometimes in the film, time gets hammered a little too much and shattered. But I'm glad that he did it.
Thank you so much, Jon. I would like to ask David, before we invite the first couple of questions from the audience, I would like to invite David to share an anecdote with us. You were present when Nolan filmed some of the scenes on the Berkeley campus, and you had a chance to actually talk to Emma Thomas, the film's producer, and also the wife of Christopher Nolan. What did you learn in your conversation with Emma Thomas?
Well, thank you for asking me about that. I didn't think I could talk my way into watching the filming, but since I had done this book, which they knew about, I was able to get in there. And when I was there, they were filming the scene right by what is now called the physics building. We used to call it LeConte. And there's this stairway, and there were people going up and down the stairway. And the filming crew was sort of behind that. So anyway, I managed to find my way in there. And Emma Thomas was very eager to talk to me. And I wasn't expecting that. And it turns out that she knows the story very well, as I guess, her husband does. And she seemed quite eager to, have an informal chit chat with somebody that knew a lot about it. And I think the people that they work with daily on the movie, they might have learned, that particular thing. But here was a chance to visit with somebody that knew the book very well and had been working in Oppenheimer studies for a long time. So she was very forthcoming. And I was particularly struck, Sigrid, with how much she knew. So I would then ask stuff like, well, are you going to film such and such and such and such? And she would instantly know what I'm talking about. No, we're not going to do that, David. Or, yes, we are actually going there tomorrow afternoon. Or, well, when we get to Princeton, we're going to do that scene. So the control that she had over the material was very impressive to me. And rather than being suspicious of the scholarly expert coming in and potentially being judgmental, rather than a kind of distance, she was open, welcoming, eager to talk. I think she'd have been glad to acknowledge her ignorance about this or that, but ignorance on her part was something that I failed to discover.
Thank you for sharing that. Betsy, I would like to turn it over to you to share some of the questions with us.
Certainly. Well, our first question is from Martha Lerman. Hi, Martha. And she says, Martha says, Richard Feynman has said, and I believe he wrote, that he was the person to break the codes and open 75% of the lockers of the scientists in the Manhattan Project. A dear friend of ours, Sam Allison, who had been a manager at the Manhattan Project, told me that it was a lowly security guard who broke into the lockers to show how poor the security was. He found that about half of the lockers has combinations of pi, others were Planck's constant, others were the natural log. What else could the scientists remember? Do you know whether it was Richard or a security guard who broke the codes?
I don't know, but talk about being in the weeds. We're really there now. Sorry, I could look it up in the book. It might be in there, but I don't remember it. However, it's an interesting anecdote because that's very characteristic of the kind of stuff that folks in the extended scientific community will come up with about this story. There'll be some highly particular thing, usually with a technical angle, that somebody will have an interesting anecdote about. And I say that not in any patronizing way. I think it's an interesting question. I just don't know the answer. Maybe you do, John.
Yeah, I believe Feynman takes credit for that. I know Feynman was the great prankster of Los Alamos, and he wrote letters to his father in code just to mess with the security people. If he didn't crack all the safes and all the lockers, I think it's likely that he cracked a great many of them.
All right. I think Feynman would say it was him too, but it was himself as well. How do you feel about the depiction, if he was alive, how do you feel about the depiction of the women in Oppenheimer's life, as well as them in the Manhattan Project?
I'll tackle that. I mean, that's a fraught question with this film. And let me cut right to the core there. I came out of the film and I was surprised and troubled that the only major women roles in the film are entirely dysfunctional. And there's something called the Bechdel test for movies. The Bechdel test is, are there two women in this film who talk with each other about something other than a man? And this film certainly fails the Bechdel test. Now, it is absolutely true that Kitty Oppenheimer and Jean Tatlock had a raft of personal problems. Jean Tatlock ended up taking her own life. Kitty Oppenheimer had a terrible problem with alcohol. But first of all, I'm always loath to remake someone else's movie. But if the film's grossed $1 billion, I'll make some comments. The other thing that was odd to me, and we may get to this later, the real life figure of Robert Wilson, who was the physicist at Los Alamos who convened the now famous Gadget seminar, the Gadget and the Future of Western Civilization. His persona, his character, who calls the moral question. The seminar was convened after the defeat of Germany, when the leaders were trying to decide whether and when to drop the bomb on Japan, probably on Japanese civilians. So it was at the sort of the moral hinge moment certainly at Los Alamos, that the Robert Wilson character is replaced by a woman physicist at Los Alamos, which is counterfactual. There were, in fact, no women in the scientific leadership at Los Alamos. Lily Honig was a chemist at Los Alamos. And so I was perplexed by that. And I had a fear that, like the African Americans who show up at Trinity site, this was sort of a retroactive correction of an historical wrong of gender exclusion or racial exclusion. So that may be harsh, but that's kind of my take on those two items.
Yeah, I'll pick that up. I agree with what Jon has said, I think that a point to be made about Jean Tatlock is that this was a woman with many dimensions, and the movie doesn't present that at all. I mean, she's a full-fledged psychiatrist, and intellectually, this is a woman of parts. So we get the love interest, we get the romance, and that seems to me to be authentic. I mean, that's consistent with what we know about the relationship, with what Jean Tatlock's good friend Edith Jenkins reports about it. So there's documentary support for a lot of that. But what's missing is not only her psychological depth and skills, but I would say equally important, the literary part. We all make a lot of Oppenheimer's engagement with John Donne's meditations and poetry. Trinity site is named for John Donne's line, batter my soul, three persons God. Now, where does he get that? He gets that from Jean Tatlock. She introduces him to John Donne's poetry. So there's a dimension there, fully consistent with everything else that's going on in the movie that you just don't get. Now, I feel a little bit differently about the Kitty Oppenheimer portrayal. I thought that got more of the things that needed to be said. Her alcoholism was really a problem, and it's represented in the movie consistent with what a lot of people say. And the first time I was at the Institute in '77, there were still a lot of people around that knew her, and their account of it is consistent with that. But crucially, she understands what goes on in 1954. And she is just furious with her husband and these attorneys for not understanding. So she and Einstein are the two people who get that. And I thought the movie was right about that. I thought also that the actress portraying Kitty Oppenheimer was extremely skillful. And that was a more demanding role, actually, than the role of Tatlock, since Tatlock was presented as such a unidimensional role. I thought that actress did a fine job with it. But the actress that did Kitty Oppenheimer had to display a variety of deeply conflicting impulses. And particularly the scene where he comes back from the hearing and she's standing there at Olden House looking out at the Institute. She turns around to face him at that moment. I thought that was a very compelling scene that she's able to convey through her expression, something that historians believe was probably true. I mean, that this was Kitty Oppenheimer as she was. So I think I want to underscore what Jon has said about Robert Wilson and how Nolan, being woke or whatever, puts this woman scientist in there when there wasn't a woman scientist. But Robert Wilson was a fascinating guy, and this gives me a chance to say that people should watch Jon's Day After Trinity, which features a long interview with Wilson in which he has a lot to say about all these things. And I think that the movie would have been rich if we'd have had a little bit more of the Wilson persona. Oh, what about that, Jon? Are we okay without that? Or what would Wilson have added?
Oh, you mean to Chris Nolan?
To the movie?
Well, I think I can't second guess what Chris Nolan would have done. I think that the Wilson character might have been a more consistent fellow to raise doubts throughout the film, and not in one minute long sequence at the very end. I will say an interesting thought experiment for all of you on all these questions is to imagine a different director making this movie. I mean, I'm glad Chris Nolan made it. The guy's a genius. But imagine switching the directors in Barbie and Oppenheimer. Imagine Greta Gerwig directing Oppenheimer, and imagine Chris Nolan directing Barbie. Well, it sounds like a joke, but think what the Oppenheimer story would be with a woman at the helm, and think of what the Oppenheimer or the Barbie story would be with a time fracturing Brit at the helm.
Interesting. Well, Professor Hollinger, this is from Eve Menger. Will you please repeat the reference to the book you mentioned at the beginning of our webinar, giving the history of the politics on the decision to drop the bomb?
Oh, yes. That's a book called A World Destroyed. A World Destroyed. Martin J. Sherwin, Alfred Knopf, 1975. A World Destroyed. And that's, of course, taken from one of these Sanskrit things that Oppenheimer translated and enunciated at various times. I am become death, destroyer of worlds. And he has these other great quotes. I think actually a better one is in the forest, in battle, at the precipice edge, in deep delirium, in deep trouble, the good deeds a man has done in the past shall protect him. So, which is something that Oppenheimer also cites in 1945 when he's afraid that the good deeds that he's done in the past, like producing the bomb, will not protect him from the Red Hunters. So the Sanskrit stuff comes in a lot. There's a terrific essay on the Sanskrit quotes by my colleague John Heilbrunn in this book that we were talking about a while ago, done on the basis of the 2004 conference. But to answer the question directly, that's a terrific book, and some of that is covered a little bit in the Bird and Sherwin book. But if you want the actual details of the diplomacy, it's definitely that you should go to the 1975 volume. Thank you for asking.
Okay, our next question from Bob Budnitz is, I'm a nuclear scientist engineer by profession. The film doesn't get into any detail at all about the incredible scientific engineering creative process at Los Alamos that was the crucial ingredient in the bomb development project's success, and about Oppenheimer's role in shepherding that process. Is this a true shortcoming, or is it, as I like to think, because the filmmaker can't possibly capture that aspect in a film like this? What do you think?
Well,
Go ahead, David.
Go ahead. I was just going to say quickly, John, you'll have a longer take on this. Briefly, that sounds great. I wish it were in the movie. It sounds to me like a mermaid.
Well, I mean, I faced the same problem, and I remember sketching out on a napkin in the dining room at La Fonda for David Peoples, trying to explain neutrons bombarding a nucleus, and not doing a very good job of it. I think the problem is I agree. Whether this film could do that, I'm not sure. A lot of smart people have a hell of a time understanding that on television. And I say that or in a movie theater, having spent a lot of my career doing science films, including films about physics. For me, a related problem is the Oppenheimer film's attempt to visualize these theoretical constructs and these physical constructs within the nucleus. And, to me, they fall flat. They are animations that don't quite hold my interest. I'm not quite sure that kind of music plays inside a nucleus. So, I think there may be some things that are best communicated in a classroom and in books. And, the sort of physics that Oppenheimer did may be that. Now, films and popular books can inspire interest in that, certainly, but I'm not sure we can do a good job of actually conveying the knowledge or the understanding.
Thank you. Next question from Stephen Matthews. Can you comment on the fact that we have the Lawrence Lab and not much named after Oppenheimer on the Berkeley campus?
Actually, I'm in a position to comment directly about that. After the conference that my colleague Catherine Carson and I co-hosted here co-organized in 2004, the then Chancellor, Robert Berdahl, noticed this very fact. And he then created for the regents a draft letter that I helped him with, that he sent to the regents saying that we want to name something for Oppenheimer. And we would like to name the pathway between the physics building, LeConte Hall, and the building directly to its east. I forget the name of that building. This is the north-south walkway between the Men's Faculty Club and the Hearst Mining Building. So he did that, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. He had the impression that it was finally approved by the regents, but there was never a sign up. So when Carol Christ came in as chancellor, I actually wrote her a personal note. I knew her well enough. I thought I could get away with this. Carol, why don't we have the signs up for Oppenheimer Way? 48 hours later, the signs were up. So for the period of about 3 years, there were signs saying Oppenheimer Way, one right at the entrance, the north entrance there near the Hearst Mining Circle, the other at the south entrance near Faculty Glade. Now, they were taken down when Nolan's crew came in to do the filming. It would be a bit odd to see a sign for Oppenheimer Way when these 1942 people were walking around. However, it seems not to have been replaced. So I wrote a note the other day to the parking office. On the Berkeley campus, signs are the responsibility of the parking office. Okay? So I wrote a note the other day saying, hey, the sign is still not up. So I'm hoping that they will put it up again. But the answer to your question is that there actually is something named after Oppenheimer, except the sign isn't there.
Tree falls in the forest. Go ahead, John.
Well, if I could add briefly, I take a contrarian view of that, not in contrary to David, but it's all about power. Lawrence and Teller won. And so we now have an enormous laboratory doing all sorts of work, including the National Ignition Facility, named after Lawrence, and we have a path named after Oppenheimer. I think that somewhere in that history, there's a lesson about, what this hearing meant and how it silenced Oppenheimer. There was a move, as I understand it, at Los Alamos in the late 50s or early 60s to actually rename the lab at Los Alamos the Oppenheimer Laboratory as a balance to Lawrence Livermore. And that never made it to first base.
But I can add, very consistent, John, with your remarks, that Bob Berdahl also had the idea that the U.S. Postal Service should issue a Oppenheimer commemorative stamp, for 40 cents or 50 cents or whatever they were in those days. And he formally requested this from the Postmaster General. Bob Berdahl did as chancellor at Berkeley. Got to have a commemorative stamp for Oppenheimer. Now, as I recall, Bob's description of what happened is that after persisting on this, the Post Office Department refused to do it. And Bob's impression was that it was still too volatile politically, which is consistent with your point about the larger structure of all of this.
This may change in the wake of Secretary of Energies.
Yeah, Secretary Granholm. Yeah, no, this was great that when she vacated that decision of 1954, and she did that after having read the Byrd and Sherwin book, which was a wonderful thing that she did that, and we're all pleased. Perhaps that will result in another change of the weather, John. I hope you're right.
Okay. Thank you. Our next question from Michael Ranney is, the film seemed to imply that Truman could have not used the bomb politically. What would have happened to Truman and his advisors if, instead of using the bomb, the US had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers invading Japan and perhaps millions of Japanese when the American people learned about the alternative possibility of using the bomb?
Most historians think that it would not have been viable for Truman to not use the bomb, maybe not when he did, but it would not have been viable for him not to use it if he had it and if American soldiers were still at risk. In some ways, that's a complicated question because so much depends on the timing. Now, if the bomb would have been held off and not used right then, scholars think it's possible that the Japanese might have still surrendered without the big invasion. However, the complication there is that even after the Hiroshima bomb, the general staff, the military, still refused to surrender. And it wasn't until the emperor came in and did it. So the scholars of that particular episode, and there are many books on this, don't come out at exactly the same place on it. But what I'm saying is that there's a real issue there as to whether the bomb was necessary to prevent an American invasion. Generally, it's agreed that the Japanese were going to surrender sooner or later, but where do you put the calculus as to when do you drop the bomb and kill all these Japanese, and how does that relate to the risk of the Americans? But in terms of the actual politics of it, I don't think that the historians disagree that Truman really could not have gone to the public and said, we had this thing and didn't use it, and then in the meantime, 100,000 Marines have died. Is that right, John, as far as you know?
Well, yeah, no, that is. Yeah, it's a fraught area. I have given up trying to relitigate that decision. But I will say, as the son of a captain in the United States Army in World War II, who might have been in the second wave going into Japan, that we will never know whether a demonstration or a series of demonstrations marching closer and closer to Tokyo, killing fewer, if any, civilians might have done the job. We don't know that. We never will. That's what Bob Wilson had proposed.
You know, it's interesting as we're talking about this to reflect on an issue that I've heard several people raise about this movie as to whether it shouldn't have had a more extensive treatment of the bomb itself. Like, do we want pictures of all these people walking around with all their injuries? Do we want an account of what the destruction was? I think that's a hard issue. My take on it is that it might be just as well that Nolan didn't do more with that because it's so big. I mean, if we're really going to confront the destruction of life through these bombs, does that impede the film's possibility to talk about the things that it does talk about? I think there's room for argument on that. And insofar as there's an argument against Nolan doing more with this, and I'll be interested in your take on this, John, but insofar as there's an argument against Nolan doing more, it's not because the bombs and what they did is unimportant. Rather, it's because they're so important. It's such a big thing. Do we really want to get into that? And if we get into that, what do we do about, say, the 20 to 24 million Chinese who were killed by the Japanese army? Are we going to say, oh, well, that's a different kind of death? Well, you can make that argument. And I'm not making an argument one or another. I'm just saying that when you start talking about how we're to deal with Hiroshima, I would much prefer a movie on John Hersey, who did the book Hiroshima in 1946. That's where we should engage with that, not here. John, do you agree?
Well, I think it was a lost opportunity in the film. I think if one of the reason we go to all these troubles to make these movies is to somehow entertain people, in the case of this film, to keep studios solvent, and to make some sort of a difference in the world, as cliched as that sounds. I think there was a missed opportunity to show what this weapon that Robert Oppenheimer, for which Robert Oppenheimer was the principal architect, to show what it does to 200,000 civilian bodies in Japan. Here was a chance to bear witness. I don't think it has to be necessarily as gruesome as it is in our film. We, in fact, were able to secure footage from Hiroshima and Nagasaki that had only been released the year before, by the way, when American forces went into Nagasaki and Hiroshima immediately after the bombings. They seized all the photographs, films, and even drawings, and that was sequestered until 1978. The problem for me, the problem for me is that we are in a slideshow at Los Alamos with Robert Oppenheimer and the scientists, and someone, I think it's Serber, is presenting a slideshow of images of people in Hiroshima. And what we're watching is Robert Oppenheimer's face. Now, I understand Christopher Nolan's interest in doing this from Oppenheimer's point of view, but Oppenheimer is watching slides of the carnage on the ground in Hiroshima. And then not too long afterwards, the only damage to human flesh that we see is the face being burned off an imagined white woman in the audience at Los Alamos. And it just seemed to me an odd set of choices. I mean, this guy is a brilliant filmmaker, and if he can't come up with a way to do it that makes the point that here's the reason we should not do this again, makes that point, but does not drive the audience out of the theater, I think Christopher Nolan's the guy to do it.
Right. We are really nearing the end of our time, but I just want to get through the questions, one of which is Lori St. Clair, who was actually asking for a transcript or a list of names and book titles that have been mentioned. I don't know if, and Lori, we'll try to get that together for you and email it to you. Christian King, it says, what do you think Oppenheimer would think of the film release and portrayal of him? Would he be impressed at his character's achievements and intelligence, or would he feel even more weight to his sense of regret? I might assume that he would believe the film doesn't represent his actual beliefs. What do you think?
Jesus, I can't handle that. John, that's yours.
But I can, only Robert Oppenheimer can handle that, and he's not here today. I will say that Robert Oppenheimer was fiercely in control of his own image, to the extent that he would not let the New Yorker change a word of an article he wrote, not even the punctuation. The first dramatization of his hearing, a play by a German playwright, Kippert, Oppenheimer got an advance copy of it, and brought legal action against Kippert to change the dialogue in the play. There's plenty of evidence that Robert Oppenheimer, after the hearing, said, "I'm out of here. This is a farce," and really declined to talk about it in years to come. So I don't know. I really don't know. I know that Oppenheimer's grandson, Charles Oppenheimer, who lives here in the Bay Area, likes the film. He actually arranged for a big premiere of the film in the IMAX theater in San Francisco. So, I mean, Charlie's the closest we're going to come to Robert, and he likes it. He finds it not entirely perfect, but he likes it.
Very, very quickly, because I know this is answered in the film, what was the main reason for Oppenheimer to go to Los Alamos?
Oh, the government set up this lab to build the bomb, and Oppenheimer had a perfect place for it. And he was somebody that was selected by General Groves, who came out here expecting to hire Lawrence. And Groves kept going to these seminars where these physicists were, chattering on about this and that. And he realized that this, pinko aesthete was actually the guy rather than the experimentalist that built the cyclotron. It's an amazing fact that somebody like Groves, so I thought was well portrayed in the movie, was capable of making that judgment.
I mean, he went to Los Alamos to build a weapon to defeat genocidal demon in Germany. That was the philosophical reason, and also to do the greatest physics experiment ever, in addition to everything David has said.
I'm not sure if he was asking why did they choose Los Alamos as a location, but I don't know. We'll move on to the next question. I attended the dedication of a small library in the early 90s named for Oppenheimer. I believe it was in Gilman or Lacan Hall. Is it still there?
Don't know.
I don't think so. There's an exhibit there. I don't know if they've named the library for Oppenheimer. I do know that the physics department has a display of a lot of artifacts. It's sort of a mini museum about Oppenheimer, but I don't know. I haven't been up there in a long time.
Okay. Was the quote unquote crybaby line accurate? Who reported it? Who was the other man in the Oval Office? We normally think of Truman as somewhat avuncular, but here he comes off quite badly.
The other guy was the Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns of South Carolina. The crybaby account may come from Oppenheimer himself. I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly what the source for that is, but I believe that it's been pretty well confirmed. John, do you know about that? Do you happen to recall?
Well,
that?
I may have the names wrong, but I believe Dean Acheson was also in the room. And he, I think in his memoirs, said that Truman, after Oppenheimer left, said, "Don't ever let that son of a bitch in my office again."
Yeah, I think that in the movie, it's only Jimmy Burns. But I think, in fact, Dean Acheson was there too. That's correct. So that's the best we can do on that, Betsy.
Thanks for your answer, says Michael Rennie, who had another question earlier. I'd heard the U.S. could only produce a bomb a month after Nagasaki. I'm not sure what that means. Is that correct?
I think so.
I'm sorry, say again.
It has to do with
I've heard the U.S. could only produce a bomb a month after Nagasaki. Is that correct?
Have the material to put together more bombs. Yeah. And I don't know for sure, but my impression is that that's a correct statement. Do you know, John?
Well, it's close. They had one more bomb ready to go. And we interviewed a fellow in Los Alamos who was to go with it. They had the non-nuclear components, that is the Fat Man casings, for 23 more ready to go. And by the time of Nagasaki, the plants at Hanford and Oak Ridge that were churning out the nuclear material were finally really up and running. So they could have continued with a string of bombs. I don't know if it would have taken as long as a month, but the Japanese would not have known, would they? If we dropped 3 in 3 weeks, what would the Japanese think?
Next question. How did the casualties from Hiroshima compare to the firebombing victims in other Japanese cities?
I believe the firebombings were worse. I believe there were more people killed in March in the firebombings than there were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki combined.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. Richard Rhodes notes that there were more people killed the night of March 9th in the firebombing of Hiroshima than any 6-hour period in history. So, it's interesting. There's a lot of talk about sin, I mean, was it a sin because it happened in 5 seconds instead of 5 hours, or because it happened in 5 minutes instead of 5 years? I mean, there are plenty of people, including Borden, who was later at the AC, who said the only novelty of Hiroshima is the efficiency and speed.
Um, Christina Kavanaugh says, "So sorry. I'm going to try to edit her question. Any comments to share regarding Ralph Austin Bard? Thank you. Served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He's noted for a memorandum he wrote to Secretary of War Henry Stimson, urging that Japan be given a warning before use of the atomic bomb on a strategic city. He was, quote unquote, the only person known to have formally dissented from the use of the atomic bomb without advance warning." Do you have any knowledge of that or comment?
I did not get that. Is it Szilard?
His name is Ralph Austin Bard, B-A-R-D. He was an
Interesting.
Assistant Secretary of the Navy.
That's a new name to me. You always learn something at these events, and I'm immediately going to go and find out who Mr. Bard.
Who is this Bard guy?
Yeah, who is this Bard? Yeah. Now there were plenty of petitions circulating at various places within the Manhattan Project, urging restraint of various sorts to varying degrees.
Especially the group at Chicago.
Yeah, the group at Chicago.
Yeah.
There's the famous Frank petition.
Right.
Dave, you probably know more about this than I do.
Yeah. Okay.
But they got nowhere. They were classified immediately by the security people. No one, as far as we know, at Los Alamos signed a petition.
What was the importance of Oppenheimer's relationship to Einstein? She says, and they're asking in the movie, but I think that if you have any comment.
I don't think there was much of a relationship.
Not much.
Well, the thing was that Einstein was very old-fashioned in his science, and everybody respected him. But I thought that the movie got across pretty well that this was a quite casual relationship, and that the old man though was deeply right about 1954.
Yeah. I mean, Oppie was Einstein's boss.
Yeah.
I will say, let me comment on one scene in the movie. We don't demand that all films be entirely accurate, but we do try to figure out what matters when it comes to things that are not exactly squeaky clean. There is a thread in the movie in which Teller originally fears that there may be ignition of the atmosphere at the Trinity shot. And in the movie, Oppenheimer goes to Einstein and has Einstein do the calculations. And it is Einstein who determines that, no, the atmosphere will not ignite. And that thread continues on up until the moment before the Trinity test in the movie. In fact, Einstein did not do those calculations. Hans Bethe did those calculations.
Right.
Does that matter? Well, in the film, you would come away believing that it was Einstein who removed that particular roadblock from the path to Trinity and hence to Hiroshima.
Hollywood.
It is. Sigrid, do you have a final question?
I have a final question, if we can answer it quickly, because we are already 10 minutes over time, which is great, and a lot of people are still with us. Why do you think there has been such a large response to Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer movie? Why is this so popular now? John,
John,
go ahead, David.
Go ahead, John. I was going to defer to you.
I'm completely baffled. I mean, compared to the nuclear fear and terror and world global fallout that was driving people crazy in the 1950s and 60s, I mean, nuclear war has just been off our radar for the last couple of decades, off most people's radar. So I'm baffled. I think we can thank Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump to some extent for getting people to think about this again. I will say that if the movie was no good, nobody would be talking about it. Number one, and number two, don't underestimate the enormous public relations and advertising effort behind this film. They put $100 million into PR everywhere you look in popular culture in the last 6 months. It's Oppenheimer, the Oppenheimer movie. If you Google Robert Oppenheimer, you're not going to get a picture of Robert Oppenheimer. You're going to get a picture of Cillian Murphy. Try it.
David, anything you would like to
No,
add?
I don't have anything to add. John has said it all.
Let me add one thing. It's very brief. Having made all these criticisms of Los Alamos, I have to say I would have been on the next train to Los Alamos in 1942 to win this war, to do great physics. You know, so where would we go from there? I don't know.
Betsy, you need to unmute yourself.
You're right. David, John, thank you so much for being here. Sigrid, thank you. Camille, thank you for working the background. And until next time,
Yeah. Thank you to everybody. This was great.
Thank you.
take care.
Take care.